Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today I'm going to show you why you should stop using 7mm Buckshot and how 5.25mm is actually better despite what you might expect based on the stats. This topic can be very confusing, so we're going to break it down into 3 segments to get the answer. Firstly, how round slowdown due to drag is implemented in Tarkov. Secondly, we'll look at how this system interacts with the damage and penetration of various rounds. And finally, we'll discuss breakpoints and why it's important when choosing which weapons perform well and which don't. Hopefully this video will leave you more informed about the overall ballistic system as well as answering our headline topic. So first things first, round slowdown. This was brought into the game in patch 12.12 and intuitively makes sense. The further a round or pellet travels, the slower it gets as it passes through the air. It starts out the fastest just as it's leaving the barrel, and from that point onwards it's getting slower and slower until it reaches our target. Now, it's important to appreciate that not all rounds slow down at the same rate. 2 identical rounds fired at different initial velocities have a similar but different overall speed profile because the faster round slows down at a quicker rate. This also makes sense intuitively as, for example, the faster you are going in your car, the more air resistance you encounter and the harder you need to step on the gas to maintain your speed. If you pull the power at 70 miles an hour, you'll slow down a lot quicker than if you were travelling at 40. With 2 identical rounds, you can have different initial velocities by shooting them out of different weapons. Guns and barrel lengths make for different round speeds in Tarkov, so a long 20-inch barreled M4 at stock is rated to 893 meters per second versus the shortest barrel version at 772. The same round fired from a faster weapon will slow down faster, but it will never become slower than the slow round. Between rounds, we also have some differences in the way that the slowdown is calculated. All rounds have what is known as a ballistic coefficient, which we can see on the website that I usually use called tarkovballistics.com, and I highly rate by the way, but we don't need to be mathematical geniuses to understand the concept. In short, this is a number that tells you how well an object travels through the air. The higher the number, the better it travels, and the less that it slows down as it moves. This is like the equivalent between a truck and a sports car. The truck cab with its large flat front would have a low number for this, and the sports car a high number because it's much more aerodynamic. The same concept applies to the rounds in Tarkov. For a few examples, 7.62x39 PS is 0.28, for 5.56 M855 is 0.233, and for 9x19 PST is 0.068. The various buckshot cartridges also have a stat for this, with 7mm being 0.013, which is very low, and 5.25mm being 0.025, which is low but a little bit higher. So for a start, 5.25mm is more aerodynamic than 7mm. So next we need to understand what this actually means for the damage and penetration. Originally, when this was first implemented, the velocity, damage and penetration scaled 1 to 1, so for every 10% of speed that was lost by a round, the corresponding amount of damage and pen was lost, also by 10%. This caused all sorts of shenanigans with rounds not headshotting PMCs with no helmets at distance and that sort of thing, which meant that some changes were made to the system. Now the damage and penetration are still tied in directly with the speed, but there's a kind of scaling in place which depends on the round. For example, a round might now lose 5% of damage and pen for every 10% loss in velocity. This helped the situation for the most part, although you do still get some scenarios such as shooting through class 4 helmets at range with low damage rounds like a Golnik. It is still possible to not kill in one hit due to the damage mitigation of armor even on penetrations, which when combined with the loss in damage over distance can fall below the head HP of 35. I'm actually an advocate of moving the head HP down to something like 20 to stop these weird situations from happening, but that's another story. Anyway, one odd ramification of this system is that using our example from earlier of the 2 identical rounds fired out of different weapons, over the same distance, the weapon with the longer barrel will actually do less damage. This sounds really weird, but it's because the damage and pen values from the round are tied to the initial velocity of the weapon that you're using for the purposes of the slowdown and the subsequent damage and pen loss. Rounds themselves have a default velocity that is adjusted by the gun, but unfortunately getting them to travel faster than this with longer barrels and muzzle devices doesn't change the starting values for damage and penetration as far as the calculation is concerned, it just makes them move quicker in game. This means that by the time the round has got to the same distance, say 100 meters, with the long-barreled weapon, it has lost more velocity as a percentage of what it started with than the round fired from the shorter barrel, because it had more velocity to give in the first place. As damage and penetration are intrinsically tied to this initial velocity specifically, it ends up doing less damage from the weapon with the higher initial speed, which is very strange. Overall, the difference is pretty small practically speaking, but it's an odd quirk of the implementation of the slowdown mechanic. Now that we understand both the slowdown itself and how it impacts damage and penetration of the rounds, we can look at breakpoints. From first glance, between 7mm and 5.25mm buckshot, the 7mm cartridge appears to be better in a very straightforward way. More damage at 39 versus 37, higher pen, the same pellet number, more armor damage, and no other stats like accuracy, recoil, or bleed chance to get in the way. However, using what we have learned, it's interesting to note that the initial velocities are quite different for these two, with 415 meters per second for 7mm buckshot and 330 meters per second for 5.25mm. Combined with the ballistic coefficient that has 5.25mm as more aerodynamic, the ramification is that 7mm slows down dramatically faster than 5.25. Despite starting with a damage of 39 in the stats, even shooting at literally point blank, you lose almost 1 damage point from the end of the barrel to the target with 7mm, and this trend continues as you move further away. Although 5.25 starts at a lower damage of 37, it overtakes 7mm buckshot at around 4 meters, after which it will almost always do more damage. In terms of breakpoints, the one that we're going to focus on here is the head hitbox. With 35 HP, a single pellet of 7mm loses enough damage to not headshot at around 5 meters. In this clip, if you had just grazed this scav with one pellet due to a near miss, he actually would not have died, only suffering 34.3 damage to the unarmored head. Compare this to our second clip here, using 5.25mm dealt 35.7 damage and is able to kill in one shot and with damage to spare with any pellet. If we extend out to around 10 meters, the damage differential is now about 2 per pellet. Not a great deal, but the 2.5 is still able to headshot with any pellet out to around 10 meters, whereas 7mm is not. In terms of general damage overall, at 10 meters with 35 versus 33 damage, this equates to 13 pellets versus 14 into the legs where there is no damage multiplier, and 18 versus 19 to a single arm as it has a damage multiplier of 0.7 once blacked. Whilst admittedly a small difference, these breakpoints can be make or break in Tarkov, so if you're outside of around 3 to 4 meters, 5.25mm buckshot outperforms 7mm, most specifically around the headshot breakpoint on grazing shots, which arguably matters the most. Although we have answered a very specific question here, I hope that this video has given you a better insight into the mechanics of the round drop-off in general and how it functions, as understanding this can help with lots of other scenarios too. If you enjoyed this video, you might also want to check out my investigation into shotgun slugs next and how the zeroing mechanics currently affect aim on these rounds, which sometimes is in ways that you might not expect. Otherwise, as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons who help to support the channel, hit all the buttons if you enjoyed the video, and as always, have fun in your raids.